Cognition, an Introduction to Cognitive Science. Evolutionary Cognition, Benjamin Miss. Environment and Evolution. When did humans first develop a modern mind? As discussed in the section on language, it's impossible to know for sure. There is no fossil record for the changes in human evolution that led to the development of the mind and of metaconsciousness. We are left looking at what is called the environment of evolutionary adaptation, the EEA. This term was coined by John Bowlby in relation to the development of his theory of attachment, and in a way, it helps us understand what is natural for humans. The best way to understand the development of our mind and cognitive abilities is to consider natural selection, the EEA, and the development and abilities of other species, comparative cognition. Our ancestors faced vastly different conditions than what you and I face today. For tens of thousands of years, our human ancestors lived in small, nomadic bands. This hunter-gatherer lifestyle influenced our evolution and the shape of our minds. It is likely that many of the modern illnesses we face, like depression and anxiety, may be due to a mismatch between our minds and the environment we live in today. First, though, let us consider an illustrative case that serves as a warning and reminds us that evolutionary psychology is fraught with guesswork. We are working backwards and making assumptions that may not be true. Fewer than 300 people live on the 80-square-mile island of Tristan da Cunha, situated in the South Atlantic, nearly equidistant between South America and Africa, at approximately the same latitude as Cape Town at the tip of South Africa. The sun shines approximately one-third of the time during the day, and it rains on more than half the days. The weather is cool, but comfortable, fluctuating between the 40s and 70s year-round. It takes 6 days to travel to and from the island by boat, weather permitting, due to rough seas and a lack of air travel facilities. The island was first settled in the 1800s, and the early population consisted of 8 males and 7 females. Spurgeon, 2013, describes an evolutionary mystery involving the high levels of asthma in the island's population of 282 people. Nearly one-third of the population has asthma. If the trait is so common, it's reasonable to think it might be beneficial in some way, but that is not the case. Understanding the high rate of asthma requires us to understand the disease and the way traits are passed on in a population. Natural selection. The adaptionist way of thinking about evolution involves the assumption that many modern traits are adaptations due to some environmental pressure, led by natural selection. Most people think about evolution in this way, looking at modern traits and deducing some environmental pressures that caused those traits to develop. Natural selection is Darwin's explanation for evolution, put forth in The Origin of the Species in 1859. At the time, Darwin's ideas were widely accepted. In fact, debates about evolution are a modern religious anti-science phenomenon. The reason people of Darwin's time understood evolution better than modern humans is the fact that in the 1800s, the most common profession was to be a farmer. Have you ever raised animals or planted crops? Farmers had first-hand experience with unnatural selection, which involves selective planting and breeding. If you plant a wheat field and see that some plants produce more wheat than others, which ones are you going to use to seed the crop next year? You, as the farmer, would select the plants with the highest yield. How do you think cows became such excellent meat and milk producers? The same breeds are not used for both milk and meat. Selective breeding has led farmers to choose the fattest cows and bulls for mating for meat breeds, and the best milk producers for having the most offspring for milk breeds. Fat pigs, big-breasted chickens, and other modern species did not develop in nature. A fat bird that cannot fly would be decimated by predators. A slow, fat bovine would similarly be at risk of natural predation. The people of Darwin's time understood evolution because they had hands-on experience. Darwin didn't propose evolution. He proposed a mechanism for evolution, which he called natural selection. Natural selection is based on the idea that there are heritable traits, and that there is variability on those traits within a species. Environmental pressures led to a change in the frequency of those traits within a population. In fact, natural selection has been directly observed. Darwin based much of his idea on differences in finch populations in the Galapagos Islands. Though similar in many ways, different populations of finches had different beaks and ate different foods. Darwin suggested that those beaks changed due to changes in their diet. The fossil record is complete with examples of species change. Selection can be seen easily, not just on farms, but in the laboratory. The short life cycle of bacteria can show change over thousands of generations in a short time. In order to question whether evolution is real, requires one to ignore clear and direct evidence. So why does 1 out of every 3 residents in Tristan da Cunha have asthma? The global rate is less than 1 in 200. The logical and incorrect solution was to look for a cause of the asthma. Once environmental causes were ruled out, showing no pathogens or pollutants, researchers began to look for an adaptive reason for asthma. Asthma has never been seen as adaptive. It involves lung inflammation and can cause difficulty breathing. Researchers were stumped, but once they stopped looking for an adaptive explanation, the answer was clear. Sometimes traits that appear to be adapted for are purely accidental, caused, in the case of Tristan da Cunha, by founder effects. A founder effect is when a trait is common in a small population and eventually becomes a large population. There was no selective pressure for asthma, but since 2 of those 15 original settlers had asthma, an unusually high rate, the genetic predisposition was passed on through the resulting population. What is the lesson from Tristan da Cunha? There are 2 points that Stephen Jay Gould makes in his 1979 critique of the adaptationists. First, Gould describes many traits as possibly spandrels. A spandrel is the arch in the corner of an arch. Beautiful, but unnecessary and only there because of the arch. The art was used to fill space. Gould adapted the term to evolutionary biology. A spandrel is something that appears selected for, but happens simply by accident, the result of something else. Asthma on Tristan da Cunha wasn't selected for. It was a founder effect. The second point Gould makes is that many evolutionary theorists assume that observed traits are the best solutions. Yet that is not how evolution works. Evolution does not choose the best solution. It takes the first solution and goes from there. If some trait helps an organism survive and reproduce, it can spread through the population. Then, further environmental pressures can cause changes in that trait, but a better solution will not re-evolve. Consider the human eye. It is similar to the eye of every other vertebrate, and represents a starting point that was the first solution, rather than the best solution. Some mollusks developed eyes along a separate evolutionary timeline, and the resulting differences are striking. If you could choose a vertebrate eye or a mollusk eye, octopus, though neither is perfect, the octopus eye offers a big advantage. Early eyes developed starting with a layer of cells that detected light. This can allow early species to know when it is daytime or where light is coming from, which can help them be more efficient at feeding, and we can see this kind of basic eye in certain species of flatworms. From there, layers of cells that collect and process more information developed over millions of years. But vertebrate eyes ended up developing backwards. Between the light source coming through the lens of the eye and the cells that detect light and color, there are layers of processing cells. In the human eye, light must travel through layers of neurons and neuron-like cells to eventually reach the light detectors. Light is getting scattered and must be corrected for through more complex processing and energy cost. In addition, in order for these neurons to communicate with the brain, they must pass through the eye, displacing those light-detecting cells. The optic nerve, which travels from the eye to the brain, dives back from the top layer of cells through the back of the eye, creating the blind spot. If you've never tested your blind spot, it's a fascinating exercise. You can literally watch an item in your field of view disappear. That area in your field of vision where the disappearance happens is where those cells leave your eye to travel to your brain. The eye of the octopus is reversed, with the light detectors on top and the processing cells below, a direct connection to the odd brain of the octopus. We have seen that evolution has not chosen the best solution. Of particular interest is the similarities between these two types of eyes. The lens and muscles that developed in order for the eye to focus are similar. This is an example of convergent evolution. Environmental pressures can create similar outcomes that evolve multiple times. The term for this is equifinality, where there are differing pathways to the same result. The marsupial wolf, which was native to Australia and faced extinction in the early 20th century, appeared to have a body similar to our traditional canines. However, the marsupial wolf evolved separately, sharing a common, closer ancestor to the kangaroo than to the placental mammals, splitting off evolutionarily over 150 million years ago. Even more striking are the physical similarities between a dolphin and a shark. Though separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolution, and though dolphins evolved from land mammals, the body shape and methods of locomotion are similar due to the aquatic environment that both species inhabit. Now we consider the actual environmental pressures that influenced the development of the human mind. We know we have to use caution in our attempt to understand our mind because we are only using our best guess rather than fossil evidence. The environment of evolutionary adaptation. John Bowlby wondered about modern life and whether it influenced the attachment issues he observed. As a therapist, Bowlby observed attachment issues in his patients. He had his own attachment issues. He lost his father at age 5. As a member of upper-class British culture, he was raised primarily by a nanny. His primary nanny left the family when he was 4, and he experienced that loss as greater than the death of his own mother years later. At the time, upper-class parents saw parental affection as spoiling their children. Bowlby objected to those views on raising children and considered the environment of evolutionary adaptation, the EEA. The EEA would have been present during a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, where the child was frequently around parents and other adults. The idea of the EEA, however, goes beyond that. We can consider the structure of the mind, our frequent errors in thinking, biases, and fears as relating not to the modern world, but to a world where humans had small, social, family groups and worked directly in nature for the sustenance and survival. Modularity of mind. The linguist Noam Chomsky, who upended psychology through his arguments that language requires innate mental machinery, influenced the idea that the mind is made up of discrete problem-solving tools that have been shaped by the needs of our ancestors in the EEA. Later researchers Cosmides and Tooby presented the idea of the mind as a Swiss Army knife with tools for various occasions. The idea is highly controversial. Many researchers see the mind as a whole, and that these abilities only appear to be separate. Some specific brain areas that are often associated with modularity include the fusiform face area, a part of the temporal lobe that is perfectly attuned to human faces. Being able to recognize faces has a massive evolutionary advantage because it eases our ability to interact with people in our social group and to identify outsiders. In tribal societies, you would need to react very differently to friends and to strangers because strangers could be extremely dangerous. The FFA is so well tuned to recognizing faces that we see faces even when a face is not present. Have you ever looked at a textured wall or a tree and some pattern of paint or bark looked like a face? Emojis and emoticons, such as smiley face and winky face, are simple symbols that we cannot help but see as faces. Neuroimaging studies show that we even process emojis in a similar way to how we process faces. Other areas associated with modularity are areas for understanding speech, producing speech, problem solving, and emotional cognition. Modularity of mind also argues for what are called domain-specific abilities, as opposed to domain-general abilities. For instance, is the ability to categorize language sounds into discrete consonant sounds, for instance, p versus b, specific to language, or part of a larger general ability to categorize all sorts of things? This is a major debate in cognition, with many researchers arguing that the appearance of modularity is due to environment and social learning pressures, and others arguing that brain activity is not particularly localized at all. An example of how decision-making works in some contexts and not others is considering the Wasson selection task. In this task, people are shown 4 cards. Each card has 2 sides, with one side having a number and the other a color, like this. The rule that if the card shows an even number, the other side must be red. Your task is to tell me which cards must be flipped in order to make sure that rule is true. Most people find this task to be difficult. It requires concentration and logical thinking, and most people get the answer wrong. Here is how you solve the problem. You do not have to turn over the 3, because it doesn't matter what color the other side is. An even number requires red, but red doesn't require an even number. We have to turn over the 8 because the rule requires the other side to be red. We don't have to turn over the red because the rule only works in one direction. If an even or odd number is on the other side, the red card can still be red. How about the blue? It must be turned over because if the other side is an even number, the rule is being violated. For many people, even reading that description is mentally taxing. What if we reframe the problem? Consider the rule that you have to be at least 21 to drink alcohol. You are at a bar, and 4 people have the following cards in front of them, showing their age on one side and what they are drinking on the other. Which cards do you have to flip to make sure no one is violating the rule? Most people find it much easier to say that they have to check the vodka card and the 16 card. The vodka drinker has to be at least 21, and the 16-year-old cannot be drinking alcohol. It doesn't matter how old the Coke drinker is, and it doesn't matter what the 21-year-old is drinking. These 2 problems are logically the same process, but people get the bar version correct more often than the number and color version. The reason this is believed to be easier is that we are assessing a natural mental process called cheater detection. Think about it from an EEA perspective. If one of the members of your tribe is not doing their part and getting away with it, then it puts the tribe at risk. If we all have to work together to survive, we need everyone to do their part. We have a natural inclination to notice when people violate rules. You notice when people break rules quite easily. These things draw our attention, even though it doesn't matter if someone breaks the rules for us to survive. Look at how salient rule breaking draws our attention. We watch crime stories on the news much more closely than human interest stories. We hate group work because of the free rider, the student who decides to not do any work because they share the same grade as the group grade. This creates an environment of mistrust and resentment, even if the rest of the group works hard. Though discussed in depth in the chapter on heuristics and biases, suboptimal decision-making caused by heuristics and biases may offer additional evidence to modularity of mind. Even if it is possible to show that the brain shows little modularity, it is likely that these mental structures that lead to errors in thinking could support the concept of modularity of mind. The Hadza and Dhobi-Jutwasi are African tribal societies that have been studied both in their natural environment and as many have made the transition away from their hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Often, this transition is not due to their choice, but due to outside pressure and encroachment on their ancestral lands. There is no need to romanticize tribal societies. Their environments are harsh. The comforts to which we are so accustomed are missing, and the unexpected that may put Westerners into debt could instead cost them their lives. What we are interested in is their lifestyle as an example of the EEA, both regarding how our minds most likely formed and what is possible for humans outside of our modern world. The Hadza and Dhobi-Jutwasi are the 2 tribes from which it is believed the click sounds present in some African languages originated. For an answer, the backslash represents what is called a dental click, related to how an English speaker might make the reproachful sound. Other clicks used as consonants in these languages are produced by English speakers when calling a horse or making the sound of a clock. These sounds have been borrowed by other languages in the area and are as natural to them as any other language sounds. The cultures of the Hadza and Dobiju are believed to have been the same for thousands of years, and represent some of the best examples of tribal societies, similar to Native Americans and Australian Aboriginal groups before Western contact. Both the Hadza and Dobiju represent egalitarian groups, where leadership is ceremonial and often based on seniority, but important decisions are left to the group. Most of their calorie intake is from foraging, supplemented by hunting. These groups have been able to maintain their way of life because they have been rather isolated, living on vast plains such as the Dobi watering hole in northern Botswana, or on the border of the Serengeti Plains in northern Tanzania. These are distinct groups that are not genetically similar. As Eastern Africa is generally accepted as the birthplace of the human race, it is likely that these groups are a living museum unto themselves, a history of our human roots. One of the reasons for the longevity has been their adaptability, moving away from encroachment onto lands that others have viewed as too inhospitable to be worth the time to colonize. Interestingly, neither group lives a terribly arduous life by modern standards. The Hadza spend less than 5 hours per day finding food and taking care of their homes. The rest of their time is social and ceremonial. Certain plants act as staples of their diet, and while some of their group had settled into a modern lifestyle, those that still live in the traditional ways are generally healthier and have better nutrition. They have small villages, with maybe a few dozen members spread out through their common lands. If conflict between two individuals becomes untenable, one of them will generally leave the village and settle in another one. Sexual relationships may last years, but are temporary, and their general relationship can be described as serial monogamy. What we think of as socialism is generally an acquired style of organization of these groups. If one member does not find enough food one day, they do not go hungry. If one member kills an animal, they all share in the fat and protein-rich addition to their diet. They are individuals, yet know they must work together in order to survive. Mental illness. While we live in a modern world, there are many variants of this world. Some people live in dense cities, where you physically pass by thousands of people every day. Tall, crowded buildings allow millions of people to live within a few square miles. Many people think city dwellers are rude because they don't look at you or acknowledge you, while to a city dweller, avoiding eye contact is actually being respectful of your personal space when you are packed body to body together on a train car. Some people live on farms, where they interact more with animals than people. Some people live in villages of a few hundred, and some people live in small towns. This variability must be considered when we think about mental illness. Perhaps, in many cases, there is a mismatch between the environment and the psychological characteristics of those who live there. As a society, we rarely consider that certain types of settlements or municipalities may allow for a better fit for our minds. Most people simply accept their environmental fate, even though some environments may increase anxiety for some people. In many ways, mental illness is a modern affliction. Some psychological disorders are only disorders in a modern environment, such as schizophrenia. In tribal groups, a person suffering from delusions may be seen as a prophet or shaman. This person might not be isolated from others, as we often see in our world. In those cultures that believe in spirits and magic, people with schizophrenia often experience the voices associated with schizophrenia as playful, rather than the critical and paranoid voices those in Western cultures experience. Depression and anxiety may also be modern problems. First, consider that for most people, depression has both biological and environmental causes. Some individuals are more likely to suffer depression, yet depression is also associated with seasonal affective disorder. While people tend to be more active in the summer and less active in the winter, those with seasonal affective disorder experience greater and debilitating extremes. Late winter is a time of depression where the long nights and low levels of sunlight compound, while the long days of summer can lead to mania. In addition to being influenced by the EEA, early farming in groups far from the equator could have influenced this, as summer is a time for farm work and harvesting, and winter is a time for rest and energy conservation. Whatever the cause, it does not appear that individuals in tribal societies suffer from depression. Anxiety could very well be related to the vast number of people we interact with on a daily basis. Modern anxiety has been described as an overactive fight or flight mechanism. When threatened, our sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive, preparing us to act to ensure our survival. In tribal societies, seeing someone you don't know is frightening. If there is a natural mechanism to cause hypervigilance around people we don't know, then a modern supermarket is a confusing place for our ancient biological systems. On one hand, we have access to massive amounts of food, something our ancestors would envy. On the other hand, we are surrounded by strangers, causing us to be hyper-alert. Individual differences could also contribute to this. Some people could have a stronger natural response to strangers, and they might be at greater risk for social anxiety. Attention deficit disorder, ADD, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, do not seem to be surprising conditions given our evolutionary history. We will ignore the overdiagnosis of these conditions in children and focus solely on the characteristics of these conditions and the environmental influences. These diagnoses could not have existed outside of a modern educational environment. It has been demonstrated that being in a natural environment reduces the symptoms of ADD and ADHD. It is also clear that the EEA did not include classrooms with desks and the requirement that you had to raise your hand to use the bathroom. So our modern environment is part of the problem. There is nothing wrong with a person who has ADHD, but there is a mismatch between their traits and the expectations of the modern environment. The hunter-farmer theory explains ADHD in terms of the need for hyperfocus and impulsivity changing between tribal hunting cultures and sedentary farming cultures. Since technological changes in the human environment have happened rather rapidly, there are many remnants of our evolutionary history that may no longer serve adaptive purposes present. Certain genetic predictors for ADHD are more common in tribal societies. While this hyperfocus may not be beneficial now, and other traits associated with it in ADHD could have offered a major benefit when hunting and stalking prey. Remember, these analyses require us to consider that the mind is a product of evolution. It sounds reasonable, but we are also guessing to a certain extent. How much has the mind changed with the rise of farming? Have pressures from the Industrial Revolution changed us? Comparative cognition. Another way of understanding our mental abilities is to consider other species and how they meet the tasks required of them. For instance, we can study conditioning in simple sea slugs due to their large neurons, which make it easy to see how these neurons change through learning. Other species demonstrate problem-solving abilities. Dogs seem to show a better understanding of object permanence than cats. Object permanence is something you developed as an infant, and it's also the reason peekaboo can be so entertaining for babies. When you cover your face, you are literally disappearing. They don't understand that when something is out of sight, it still exists. It is difficult to compare intelligence between species, partly because it is difficult to define intelligence in the first place. Comparing brain size and structure is helpful, but brain size increases with body weight. This means it is more useful to create an index showing brain size in relation to body size. The encephalization index is used to show how we compare to other species. The chimpanzee, though our closest genetic relative, has a far smaller brain-to-body ratio. Most other mammals have a similar ratio to the elephant, and this tells us that chimpanzees are closer in brain ratio to dogs than they are to us. The encephalization index is incomplete, however, in that it does not do a good job of taking aquatic mammals and non-mammalian species into account. Dolphins, for instance, have a higher encephalization ratio than chimpanzees, but aquatic mammals can support larger brains due to buoyancy. Cephalopods, like octopuses, show problem-solving abilities similar to many mammals, but they have no centralized brain and seem able to move their tentacles independently, without central control. Try to move your arms independently, such as cutting paper with one hand while bouncing a ball against a wall with the other. Crows and other corvids show strong social behavior, teamwork, and problem-solving, and by the encephalization index, they're next to chimpanzees. However, birds have nearly double the number of synapses per volume. So combined with a shorter distance neurons have to travel, they could appear far closer to humans on the Encephalization Index than chimpanzees. The most intelligent fish are manta rays, which perform similar to chimpanzees and dolphins on some measures, and freshwater elephant fish, which have an Encephalization Index which may be higher than that of humans. Does this mean they are more intelligent than we are? We must either accept that the elephant fish is the true master of the earth, or understand that the Encephalization Index does not tell the whole story. For instance, other cognitive needs may limit intelligent problem-solving behavior. The elephant fish has brain structures dedicated to interpreting the bioelectrical signals they produce for hunting. Dolphins and crows must move in 3 dimensions, while we effectively move in 2, creating greater navigation need and seen in the large dolphin parietal lobe. Each species develops into an ecological niche, and intelligence is species-specific. What matters to each member of a species is how well it can survive and reproduce. Back to terrestrial mammals. The neocortex is most associated with intelligence, and humans have, by far, the largest proportion of the brain that is neocortex. The neocortex is the wrinkly part we see on the surface of the brain, and the white matter connections beneath it. All mammals have similar brain stems and limbic system structures associated with emotion. It appears that the neocortex shows the greatest difference between high and low intelligent species. Studies of ancient mammals suggest that early mammals had brains similar to reptiles, with large areas dedicated to scent and small areas dedicated to vision. Compare that with the modern human brain, with large portions tasked with visual perception and with language. While studying the brains of other organisms is helpful, we are still unlikely to ever know for sure the true selective pressures on the development of the human mind. Thank you.